Hello. So in this last part of the lecture, I would like to tell you about the implications for linguistic theory. What can Pidgins and creoles teach us about language? So you now know that creoles are formed from Pidgins. And some people, you also know that creoles are often developed by children. So creoles emerge from Pidgins whenever children have to learn Pidgins. So some people say, well, children are adding syntactic complexity, they're adding grammar to Pidgins where there is no such, where the grammar is not there, right? So this is an example of the poverty of the stimulus. You will remember that Noam Chomsky said children must have universal grammar because they learn things that they don't hear. And it's true for normal language, so we are able to say things that we never heard before. But it's even more obvious in the case of Pidgins and creoles. So it's not just that children don't hear particular grammatical structures, is that those structures are not there in the Pidgin. And yet children create grammar. And so some would say, well, this is a special example of poverty of the stimulus, and this grammar that children are adding must be coming from their innate language learning device, from their universal grammar. And so the question could be, is it, when we look at how creoles develop from Pidgins, is this how language originally developed? Was it the case that we were using a simplified communication, kind of like what apes are using if we teach them words? And at some point, this became more complex. There was a genetic universal grammar, and we started adding this complexity. Perhaps the language that we speak today developed from a Pidgin-like language. Maybe this is how it happened. So people are very interested in studying Pidgins and creoles. And one particularly interesting example comes from Nicaraguan Sign Language. So the first Nicaraguan school for the deaf was opened in 1980, in the year 1980. And the first students didn't speak any sign language. What they did have was some limited signs that each family developed. So each family that had a deaf child, the child couldn't learn sign language, there was no sign language, they developed their own little sign. You could say this was their own language. And so children from different families with different little sign languages started going to the first school for the deaf. And when those family sign languages got mixed, they gave rise to the Pidgin, LSN. So this was a very simple sign language, the first sign language there, that all the children spoke. It didn't have full grammar, it didn't have a lot of words. But in time, when the younger children joined the school, so aged 4, they were seeing LSN as their first language, their first input. And within 3 years, they developed a full language out of this Pidgin, ISN, which was a creole. And so the younger children added complexity from the very simple Pidgin. Now older children who joined the school earlier, never learned ISN, and they continued using the Pidgin. So you may remember from our discussion of first and second language acquisition that this is what we see in first and second language in children and adults, right? So children learn full language, but adults, when they start learning late, they are unable to do that. And this, we said, may be due to the critical period. So the Nicaraguan Sign Language, this particular ISN Creole, could be more evidence for critical period. Now, this piece of evidence is particularly interesting because, unlike Genie, these children were not deprived of anything. They were cognitively normal. They had normal development. They weren't abused. They came from happy families. There was nothing wrong with them. They just were learning language from scratch because they were deaf. Another important thing about this example is that the Pidgin, there wasn't any native language that the language came from. So basically it was a language developed from scratch, from zero. So it is an example of a birth of a completely new language. And this birth was given by small children who, just being exposed to a simplified form of language, the Pidgin, they added grammatical complexity, which could be from the universal grammar. So to summarize everything that we talked about in this lecture, first of all, I told you about language contact and how when people of different languages have to communicate, they can either use a third language, lingua franca, or a mixture of their languages, that is a Pidgin. Now, Pidgins are very limited languages, but in time develop complexity and become a Creole. This could actually be how language developed in humans. And it also provides evidence for critical period hypothesis because children are adding grammar coming from universal grammar to a language that doesn't have any. And that's all for today.